Story 1. The Hen Who Solved a Village Jewel Theft. In the rolling countryside of Wiltshire, not far from the chalk hills and hedgerows that stitched together a patchwork of sleepy farms, there was a village that most maps forgot. Its lanes curved like question marks, its cottages stood low and wide, and its people knew each other's rhythms almost as well as their own. It was a place where gossip traveled faster than the parish bell, and yet serious crime was thought to belong to larger towns, to cities with shadows and strangers. But in the late spring of 1929, that quiet assumption unraveled. The village, Barton Green, was small enough that everyone's dog had a name known beyond its master's gate. Children ran barefoot across the green, postmen stopped for tea in the homes they delivered to, and the constable's greatest occupation was settling drunken arguments at the public house. Life moved at a measured pace, punctuated by Sunday sermons, market days, and the occasional village fair. This was a community where real theft, not the borrowing of tools left too long in another's shed, seemed unthinkable. Until, that is, the morning that Mrs. Eleanor Cartwright, widow of a prosperous farmer, discovered her jewel case missing. The victim. Mrs. Cartwright was not wealthy by London standards, but in Barton Green she was regarded as a woman of means. Her late husband had left her a comfortable estate, a stout brick house at the edge of the green, a few fields leased to tenant farmers, and most enviably a small collection of heirloom jewelry. She rarely wore the pieces, except to church on Easter or Christmas, but everyone in the village knew of them. A sapphire brooch said to have belonged to her grandmother, a string of freshwater pearls from her wedding, and several rings that bore the initials of her husband's line. To Mrs. Cartwright, these were not just ornaments. They were the tangible remnants of a life lived beside a man whose memory still anchored her. So when the jewel case disappeared from her dressing table, it was more than a loss of property. It was the theft of comfort, of continuity, of memory itself. The discovery. The discovery came quietly. A housemaid, Mary Kemp, had gone to draw the curtains in Mrs. Cartwright's bedroom that morning. She noticed the dressing table's surface was unusually bare. The carved wooden case, small enough to tuck under an arm but heavy with brass fittings, was gone. Mary assumed at first that her mistress had moved it, but when Mrs. Cartwright entered moments later, her voice caught in her throat. "Where is it?" she asked, almost to herself. Mary stammered. "The case, ma'am, it was here last night." The absence was so stark it silenced them both. For a moment Mrs. Cartwright refused to believe it. She opened drawers, peered beneath the bed, even asked if perhaps Mary had dusted it away. But of course, a jewel case cannot vanish into air. By noon, the constable had been summoned. The constable, Reginald Reggie Blythe, was not accustomed to such matters. He was a man of round shoulders, more given to leaning on his bicycle than chasing after thieves. His duties generally involved admonishing lads for pilfering apples or breaking up disputes about hedgerows. When he arrived at the Cartwright home, helmet askew, notebook in hand, he looked less like an investigator and more like a schoolteacher summoned to an unruly classroom. He examined the dressing table, jotted down the maid's account, and asked perfunctory questions about visitors, open windows, and locked doors. His inspection yielded little. No window latch was broken, no footprint stood out in the garden, and the door locks appeared untouched. "Inside job, perhaps," Blythe muttered, scribbling in his notebook. The phrase hung uncomfortably in the air, as though accusing the very household he stood within. Suspicion, though. It did not take long for whispers to ripple across Barton Green. Villagers speculated freely, as though every shop counter and church pew were suddenly a witness box. Some whispered of the maid, Mary, who had been in service barely a year and whose family had known hardship in the next parish. Others muttered about the gardener, Thomas, who was said to drink heavily and whose wages were often late. Mrs. Cartwright herself, though visibly shaken, was unwilling to accuse. Yet she, too, wondered, could someone in her household betray her? Constable Blythe, lacking any physical evidence, could only take statements. His investigation soon bogged down in speculation, with no clear suspect and no trace of the jewel case. A village uneasy. For Barton Green, the theft was not merely a matter of missing trinkets. It was a breach of trust. Windows were closed earlier, doors bolted more tightly. The postmistress spoke of it daily, the vicar wove sermons about honesty, and the children whispered tales of burglars lurking in the hedges. The rhythm of village life, once so steady, now carried an undercurrent of suspicion. The theft had shaken not only Mrs. Cartwright's household, but the entire community's sense of safety. An unlikely witness. It might have ended there, an unsolved burglary, left to the dusty corners of memory had it not been for a hen. Her name was Bess, a plump brown hen belonging to the Davies family, who lived 2 cottages away from Mrs. Cartwright. Bess had a reputation for wandering beyond the garden gate, scratching in neighbors' hedges, and occasionally slipping into the churchyard. Most villagers found her antics amusing, though Mrs. Cartwright herself had scolded the bird on more than one occasion for pecking at her flower beds. 1 week after the theft, young Peter Davies, sent to fetch the hen home, followed Bess as she clucked happily across the green. She darted behind a tangle of brambles at the base of an old elm, and it was there, as Peter reached to grab her, that he noticed something half buried in the dirt, a glint of brass. He pulled it free and his breath caught. It was the hinge of a small box, broken clean away. The clue emerges. Peter showed the piece to his father, who, recognizing the object, marched it to Constable Blythe. The constable, astonished, brought it at once to Mrs. Cartwright. She identified it immediately. It belonged to her missing jewel case. The discovery changed everything. For the first time, there was evidence. The case had been carried outside, across the green, and discarded or perhaps hidden within reach of a wandering hen. Yet with this clue came more questions than answers. Why discard the box but not the jewels? Had the thief hidden the contents elsewhere? Or had the case broken in the struggle, spilling fragments as it was dragged away? Constable Blythe was forced to widen his search. He poked among hedges, scraped at soil, and even questioned the Davies boy about where the hen liked to roam. But the jewels themselves remained missing. The village divides. The clue ignited fresh speculation. Some villagers saw it as proof that the thief had been an outsider, passing through and using the cover of night to carry away the loot. Others clung to suspicion of those within the household, arguing that only a servant or gardener could have moved the case without forcing entry. Mary Kemp, the maid, endured sharp glances at the bakery. Thomas, the gardener, found himself unwelcome at the tavern's back table. Innocence was harder to prove than guilt was to assume, and in a village where everyone's past was known, old grudges colored new suspicions. A case at a standstill. Weeks passed. Blythe's notebook filled with fruitless lines of inquiry. He sent word to the county police in Devizes, but their interest in a handful of missing jewels was limited. For Mrs. Cartwright, hope waned with each day that the jewels failed to resurface. And yet there was that hinge, small, solid, irrefutable. It suggested that the case had not left Barton Green entirely. Somewhere in the hedgerows or cottages, perhaps even beneath the feet of those who still whispered about it, lay the rest of the truth. An unresolved question. The villagers could not stop asking themselves, who among them could have carried away a widow's jewels, and why? Constable Blythe, turning the brass hinge over in his hand one evening, found himself staring out across the green where Bess the hen still scratched. Somewhere out there was the missing case, and the answer to a theft that had unsettled more than one woman's dressing table. It had unsettled the very trust of a community. And so the first chapter of Barton Green's strange little crime closed, not with resolution but with unease. What else might the hen lead them to discover? The discovery of the brass hinge had given Barton Green something tangible at last, But instead of bringing the village closer to truth, it deepened the mystery. For if the case had indeed been carried across the green, it suggested that someone had risked walking openly in the night, burdened with both wooden box and stolen jewelry. And if the thief had gone so far, where had they disappeared afterward? Constable Blythe's dilemma. Constable Reggie Blythe, though mocked by some as a man more fond of pipe smoke than police work, took the clues seriously. In his cramped station room, a single-room cottage that doubled as both office and lockup, he spread his notes across a table and tried to make sense of it all. 3 names kept returning to the page. Mary Kemp, the maid. Opportunity lay at her feet. She moved about the house freely and would have known where the jewel case was kept. Yet her wages were modest, her family's struggles known, and in the eyes of many villagers that made her an easy suspect. Thomas Hales, the gardener. He worked the grounds daily, often alone, with little oversight. He was a man of calloused hands, quick temper, and heavy drinking, a combination that never sat well in public imagination. An outsider, perhaps a vagrant or passing traveler. Barton Green lay near the coach road to Salisbury, and sometimes peddlers stopped at the inn. Could a stranger have slipped into the Cartwright home, unseen? Blythe wrestled with these options. Each carried problems. Mary's devotion to her mistress seemed genuine. Thomas's gruffness was real, but stealing jewels would require cunning he had never shown. As for an outsider, how would they have known where to look or dared to search a widow's home so precisely? The brass hinge taunted him proof of a crime, but proof of nothing more. The hen's wanderings. Meanwhile, young Peter Davies became something of a village hero. Wherever he went, villagers asked, where did Bess Scratch last? His hen, once a nuisance, was suddenly a kind of feathered detective, her foraging habits thought to hold the key to the case. Peter, encouraged by the attention, began following Bess more closely. On one afternoon, she darted again toward the hedgerows, this time near the boundary between Mrs. Cartwright's field and the old mill lane. There, half hidden beneath nettles, Peter spotted something else, a fragment of velvet lining, torn and damp. He plucked it out carefully. When shown to Mrs. Cartwright, she confirmed it unmistakably from inside her jewel case. The thief, it seemed, had indeed carried the box outward and perhaps broken it apart. The case was no longer confined to imagination. Pieces of it, literally, were surfacing in the village's soil. Suspicions grow. With each discovery, suspicion deepened against those closest to the Cartwright household. The maid, Mary, began to feel the weight of public opinion pressing against her. Women at the market whispered as she passed, their eyes cutting sharp as knives. She protested her innocence, telling anyone who would listen that she loved her mistress too dearly to betray her. Thomas, the gardener, fared no better. One evening at the public house, a farmer accused him outright of hiding the jewels. A scuffle broke out, broken only when Blythe himself strode in and threatened to fine them both for disorderly conduct. The division was no longer quiet gossip, it was open fracture, and Mrs. Cartwright, once surrounded by sympathy, now found her home a stage for suspicion. The county inspector. News of the scattered evidence eventually reached Devizes, and the county police sent Inspector Harold Pike to Barton Green. Unlike Blythe, Pike was a professional detective, tall, sharp-eyed, with a clipped manner that unsettled villagers unused to such authority. Pike walked the village like a man measuring it. He questioned the Cartwright servants rigorously, inspected the grounds, and even ordered a systematic search of the hedgerows. He praised young Peter for his keen observation, but warned the villagers not to place blind faith in poultry. His methodical approach impressed some, but ruffled others. Barton Green was not accustomed to outsiders telling them who might be guilty, yet Pike pressed on. A hidden motive. Inspector Pike began asking deeper questions. Had Mrs. Cartwright's jewels been insured? Was there anyone in her family who might benefit from their disappearance? Such queries unsettled the widow, who bristled at the implication. Still, Pike found no evidence of insurance fraud or family intrigue. His focus turned back to the servants. Mary was questioned for hours. Thomas, too, was pressed about his whereabouts the night of the theft. But what Pike wanted most was the rest of the jewel case. Without it, he told Blythe, "We are fumbling in darkness." The turning point. Then, one damp morning in early June, a farmhand stumbled upon something curious. While cutting through the meadow near the brook, he noticed a faint glimmer in the mud. Bending down, he retrieved a ring delicate, silver, set with a small pearl. It was one of Mrs. Cartwright. The brook ran just beyond the hedgerow where the fragments had been found. Could the thief have attempted to dispose of the jewels there, only to drop one? Or had the brook carried it from a hidden cache? The discovery reignited the investigation. Pike ordered the brook dredged. Men with long poles probed the shallows, children clambered along the banks, and villagers gathered to watch. For 2 days they pulled up nothing but reeds and stones. But on the third day, another find, a gold clasp broken, engraved with the Cartwright crest. The brook had become a silent witness. False leads and quiet tension. Yet for all these fragments, no full trove appeared. Pike grew restless, and Blythe, torn between duty and loyalty to his neighbors, found himself trapped. Every villager had become both suspect and spectator. The public house buzzed with theories. Some believed Mary had stolen the jewels but panicked, discarding them piece by piece. Others insisted Thomas had buried them, only for animals or hens to scatter them. And then came the whispers of outsiders again. A peddler seen near the coach road, a tramp who had begged at the inn weeks before. Each rumor became fuel for speculation, each citing a phantom culprit. Mrs. Cartwright's anguish. For Mrs. Cartwright, the ordeal was agony. She had lost not just her jewels but her peace of mind. She no longer slept soundly. The creak of floorboards sent her sitting upright in bed. She dismissed neither Mary nor Thomas, unwilling to condemn without proof, yet their presence now carried tension. Meals in her home grew silent, strained. What hurt her most, she confided to a neighbor, was not the missing gems but the sense that her household had become a battleground of suspicion. A final clue from Bess. Then, almost as if fate conspired through feathers, Bess the hen led Peter once more to discovery. This time, she scratched near the base of the stone wall that marked the village's western boundary. There, lodged between 2 stones, was something unmistakable, a delicate chain, tangled and broken, but still glittering. Mrs. Cartwright recognized it immediately, her sapphire pendant, though the stone itself was missing. The village erupted in speculation anew. How had the pendant found its way into the wall? Had it been hidden deliberately or dropped in flight? And more importantly, if the pendant had been separated from its sapphire, who now held the missing gem? A darker possibility. Inspector Pike gathered the items, the ring, the clasp, the chain, and laid them out before Mrs. Cartwright. Together, they painted a troubling picture. The jewels were being scattered, discarded, broken apart. "This is not the work of a professional thief," Pike muttered. "It smacks of panic, or of someone who cannot sell what they've taken." For the first time, he entertained a possibility he had resisted. The culprit was not a stranger at all, but someone within Barton Green. Someone frightened, clumsy, and now desperate. The cliffhanger. That evening, as Pike reviewed his notes in the constable's station, a knock came at the door. A boy from the inn stood there, breathless. "Sir," he gasped, "they've found something in the fire pit behind the public house." When Pike and Blythe arrived, villagers had already gathered. In the ashes of the pit lay something blackened but recognizable, the charred remains of a velvet pouch. And inside, barely spared by the flames, a single sapphire glimmered faintly against the soot. The jewel had resurfaced, but who had tried to burn away the rest? The sapphire pulled from the ashes was like a truth dragged reluctantly into daylight. For weeks, The village had argued, whispered, and accused. Now, at last, there was evidence too stark to ignore. Someone had tried to destroy what they could not conceal. The inspector's realization. Inspector Pike, stern and unsentimental, turned the charred pouch over in his gloved hands. The velvet was scorched, the drawstring burned away, but the gem, deep blue, sharp-edged, had resisted the flames. "It is the act of a desperate thief," Pike told the assembled crowd, "one who knows they are cornered." Constable Blythe glanced at the villagers gathered in the fading light. He saw their faces, anxious, expectant, almost eager. They wanted a name. They wanted resolution, even if it meant condemning one of their own. Narrowing the circle. Pike ordered another round of questioning. The circle of suspects had narrowed. An outsider would not have buried fragments in the hedgerow, nor hidden chains in a wall, nor risked burning evidence at the inn's fire pit. No, this was someone rooted in Barton Green. He looked first at Thomas the gardener. The man's reputation for drink made him an easy scapegoat, but under questioning, Thomas produced a solid alibi. On the night of the burning, he had been mending tools in the smithy, a fact corroborated by the blacksmith himself. Then came Mary Kemp, the maid. Nervous, pale, and weary of suspicion, she trembled as Pike questioned her. Yet her answers remained steady. She had no access to the inn's fire pit, nor reason to be there after dark. And so suspicion shifted elsewhere to the inn itself. The innkeeper's son. The village inn, the Crown and Sheaf, was run by George Linton, a stout man with a booming laugh and a fondness for stories. His son, Edward Eddy, to most worked behind the bar, fetched coal and cleaned out the ash pit each morning. Eddy was 20, restless, and known to grumble about the smallness of village life. Some whispered he longed for the city, for excitement and money he did not have. Pike asked when Eddy had last cleaned the pit. Eddy hesitated. "A few nights ago," he muttered, "before the rain came." His eyes shifted, and Pike, seasoned in the art of lies, saw the tremor of guilt. Evidence mounts. A search of the Linton property followed. In Eddy's small upstairs room, tucked beneath a loose floorboard, they found the remains of another jewel setting empty, prized open with crude force. The discovery was damning. When confronted, Eddy denied it at first. He claimed he had found the jewels scattered and panicked, fearing he would be blamed. He had hidden what he discovered, then, overcome with fear, attempted to burn the evidence. But under the inspector's steady pressure, the truth emerged. The confession. Eddy admitted to entering the Cartwright home. He had worked odd jobs there before and knew the back door's faulty latch. On the night in question, emboldened by drink and driven by resentment at his narrow life, he slipped inside. He had not planned carefully. He stumbled in the dark, fumbled through drawers, and seized the jewel case more for the thrill than for its worth. But when he tried to sell the jewels, he quickly realized the truth. They were too well known, too distinctive. No pawnbroker would touch them. Panic set in. He tried hiding the case in hedgerows, breaking it apart, scattering fragments. When villagers began searching, he grew more frantic, attempting to burn what remained. But the jewels resisted him, surfacing again and again, like truths refusing to stay buried. The hen's role. Bess the hen, in her stubborn wanderings, had done what neither constable nor inspector could. She had scratched at the earth where Eddy's clumsy hiding places failed. Piece by piece, she exposed his secret. When Pike told this to the villagers, a murmur of awe rippled through them. That a hen had led them to the truth seemed both absurd and inevitable, the sort of tale destined to be retold for generations. The trial. Eddy Linton was arrested and taken to Devizes. His trial was swift. The evidence, the fragments, the pouch, the gem was overwhelming. His confession sealed his fate. He was sentenced not to prison for life, but to several years of hard labor. The court acknowledged his youth, his lack of sophistication, and the fact that much of the stolen property had been recovered. For Mrs. Cartwright, the verdict was bittersweet. She regained some of her jewels, though many were damaged or lost beyond repair. The sapphire pendant, once her most cherished piece, was scarred but intact. Yet the sense of safety she had once felt in Barton Green was gone forever. The aftermath. The village, too, bore scars. Gossip quieted, but trust did not fully return. Some felt sympathy for Eddie, arguing that frustration with small-town life had driven him to folly. Others saw him as proof that vice lurked even among familiar faces. Constable Blythe resumed his rounds, though villagers regarded him with less patience now, remembering how the hen had proven more useful than his notebook. Inspector Pike returned to Devizes, satisfied with the resolution, but leaving behind a village that would never see itself quite the same way again. And Bess the hen, she strutted about the green, none the wiser to her fame. Children followed her as though she were a feathered oracle, and Peter Davies proudly reminded anyone who would listen that it was his hen who had solved the jewel theft. A reflection. The story of Barton Green's jewel theft became something larger than the crime itself. It was a reminder of how fragile trust is in small communities, how quickly suspicion can divide neighbors, and how truth sometimes emerges not through clever deduction, but through persistence or sheer accident. For Mrs. Cartwright, the case was a wound that never fully healed, yet she often remarked, years later, that she preferred her jewels scarred and incomplete, for they carried the memory not only of her family, but of the strange season when a village was consumed by suspicion, and a hen became its most unlikely detective. Closing thought. And so, the case of the stolen jewels ended not with cunning criminals or dramatic chases, but with clumsiness, panic, and the scratching claws of a wandering hen. It leaves us to wonder, how many crimes are solved not by brilliance, but by accident, and how many truths lie waiting, hidden in the hedgerows of our own lives, until something ordinary scratches them free. Story 2. The Librarian's Forged Footnotes, a small-town academic fraud. In the late 1950s, the town of Marlow-on-Trent in Derbyshire was best known for its river ferries, its market square, and a library that sat like a quiet sentinel at the edge of the high street. The Marlow Public Library was not grand, but to the townsfolk, it was a cherished institution. Rows of oak shelves, a stern grandfather clock ticking in the corner, and reading lamps that glowed like small suns in the dark English winters. For decades, the library had been overseen by one man, Harold Sykes, a librarian whose wire spectacles and shuffling gait made him nearly as much a fixture as the shelves themselves. He had begun as a junior clerk before the war, risen slowly through the ranks, and by the late 1950s had become head librarian. He was not a man of flair or authority, but he was steady, dependable, and utterly devoted to books. The discovery. The scandal that would one day shake Marlow-on-Trent began not with a theft, but with a discovery by a visiting scholar. In 1957, Dr. Alice Morton, a lecturer in history at the University of Sheffield, came to the library while researching local church records. She was interested in Marlow's role in the 17th century, its parish disputes, its land grants, its role in the tumultuous Civil War years. The library possessed several rare volumes, including a handwritten collection of parish accounts dating back to 1621. As Dr. Morton leafed through the fragile pages, she noticed something odd. Footnotes had been added in pencil, squeezed into the margins. At first, she assumed these were annotations from a previous scholar. But the notes struck her as peculiar. They cited sources that did not exist, referred to events for which no other record could be found, and most troublingly, they all pointed toward a single conclusion: that Marlow-on-Trent had played a far greater role in national history than anyone had previously recognized. A grand claim. The notes suggested that Marlow's parish had been a secret center of royalist support, that clandestine meetings of prominent figures had taken place there, and that even King Charles himself had once passed through the town incognito. It was an alluring claim. To historians, such a revelation would elevate a quiet market town into a place of national significance. To the town's own residents, it would make Marlow something more than a sleepy backwater. But to Dr. Morton, the notes raised red flags. The handwriting seemed consistent across multiple volumes, yet the references they cited obscure pamphlets, supposed diaries, unnamed local chronicles, were nowhere to be found in the university archives. Dr. Morton raises questions. Dr. Morton approached Harold Sykes politely, asking if he knew who had annotated the parish records. Harold adjusted his spectacles, frowned, and insisted that the notes had been there for as long as I can recall. He offered no explanation as to their origin. When Dr. Morton pressed further, suggesting that the annotations might be modern additions rather than genuine historical notes, Harold bristled. "These records are carefully maintained," he said firmly. "You'll find no tampering here." Dr. Morton left unsettled. She mentioned the matter to colleagues back in Sheffield, who encouraged her to investigate further. The whispers begin. Soon, word spread quietly among the academic community. The Marlow Parish records might not be entirely authentic. By early 1958, a second scholar, Professor David Clegg, visited Marlow to examine the notes. His conclusion was sharper. The footnotes were deliberate fabrications, crafted to inflate the historical significance of the town. But why and by whom? Motive in plain sight. To many, the motive seemed obvious. In post-war England, small towns were struggling to keep their identities alive. Tourism offered survival, and heritage, even if exaggerated, was valuable. If Marlow could claim to have hosted a king, it might attract attention, visitors, and funding. But who would go so far as to falsify records? The villagers themselves were skeptical of the scholar's accusations. They trusted Harold Sykes implicitly. He was, after all, the keeper of their library, a man who had dedicated his life to the quiet guardianship of books. To accuse him of deceit was to accuse the town itself. Yet evidence mounted. The investigation deepens. By summer 1958, the matter had drawn the attention of the County Records Office. Archivists compared the Marlow volumes with other surviving parish records. Discrepancies abounded. Whole events mentioned in the Marlow books appeared nowhere else. Marginal notes cited sources that, when checked, proved non-existent. One archivist went further, examining the pencil itself. The graphite was modern, the strokes too clean to have survived centuries. The conclusion was undeniable. Someone had added the notes within the past few decades. The finger inevitably pointed to Harold. As head librarian, he had access to the books, the time to annotate them, and the motive, conscious or not, of elevating the importance of his beloved town. Harold under scrutiny. When questioned formally, Harold denied any wrongdoing. His answers, however, were evasive. Asked why the pencil annotations looked so recent, he shrugged. Asked why all the fabricated notes pointed toward glorifying Marlow, he claimed coincidence. Villagers rallied to his defense. Letters appeared in the local paper insisting on his innocence, describing him as a man too gentle and too dedicated to stoop to forgery. Yet the academic community was less forgiving. Professor Clegg published a scathing article in the Historical Review, accusing Marlow's library of deliberate manipulation of the historical record. It was, he wrote, a deception unworthy of scholarship. The article drew national attention. Suddenly, a quiet town's library became the subject of academic scandal. The divide. The people of Marlow-on-Trent divided sharply. To many villagers, Harold was a scapegoat, a victim of academic snobbery from city scholars who looked down on small towns. To others, doubt began to creep in. Could their kindly librarian really have orchestrated such a fraud? Dr. Morton, meanwhile, returned to the parish volumes with renewed determination. This time, She noticed not only the false notes but subtle erasures, faint smudges where original text seemed to have been rubbed away. It was no longer just a matter of added notes, but of altered history. The unanswered question. By the end of 1958, the scandal had grown too large to ignore. The county records office demanded that the volumes be surrendered for preservation and examination. Harold resisted, insisting the books belonged to Marlowe. Villagers rallied to his side, forming a petition to keep the records in town. The tension mounted until one night in November, when Harold was seen carrying a heavy satchel out of the library after closing. He claimed it contained personal papers, but those who glimpsed the satchel swore it looked suspiciously like the parish volumes themselves. And then, for several days, Harold Sykes did not appear at the library at all. When Harold Sykes failed to appear at the library the following morning, the first to notice was his assistant, a timid young clerk named Margaret Poole. She unlocked the doors, set the lamps aglow, and realized the librarian's familiar shuffle was absent. The grandfather clock ticked, the dust motes danced in the sunlight, but Harold's chair stood empty. At first, Margaret thought nothing of it. Perhaps Harold was unwell. But by midday, whispers began circulating. Someone had seen him late at night with a heavy satchel. Someone else swore he had boarded an early train toward Nottingham. The absence, paired with rumor, cast a dark shadow. Had the head librarian fled with the contested parish volumes? The town in uproar. By afternoon, the library filled with villagers demanding answers. The parish records were not simply old books, they were treasures of Marlowe-on-Trent, symbols of its identity. The thought of them vanishing stirred panic. Some accused Harold outright of theft. Others defended him fiercely, saying the poor man was hounded unfairly by scholars and officials. The library's calm was replaced with argument, voices rising among the shelves. Constable Edmund Toller, the town's officer, was summoned to restore order. He listened grimly, then admitted he too had not seen Harold since the night before. The county records office steps in. Word traveled quickly to the county records office in Derby. Archivists, already frustrated with Harold's resistance, saw his disappearance as confirmation of guilt. They dispatched inspectors to Marlowe at once, determined to secure the parish volumes before they vanished altogether. When they arrived, they found the shelves where the records had once rested empty. Margaret Poole, flustered and pale, could only insist she had no knowledge of where they'd gone. The investigators' conclusion was stark. Harold Sykes had absconded with the volumes, perhaps to destroy them, perhaps to continue altering them beyond scrutiny. The search for Harold. A manhunt of sorts began, though it was hardly the scale of national importance. Notices went to neighboring towns, railway stations were queried, and innkeepers were asked whether a bespectacled man carrying heavy books had passed their way. Days turned into a week. No sign of Harold appeared. Yet curiously, a letter arrived at the library addressed to Margaret. It bore Harold's handwriting, familiar and precise. Inside, he insisted he was innocent. He claimed he had taken the books for their protection against the slander of outsiders. He wrote that the annotations were genuine, passed down from earlier keepers of the records, and accused the scholars of conspiring to discredit Marlowe. It was a defiant letter, yet strangely evasive. He gave no return address, only a vague assurance that he would return when the storm had passed. Divisions deepened. The letter divided the town even more sharply. To Harold's defenders, it was proof that he was shielding the library from elitist academics. To his detractors, it was the confession of a guilty man unwilling to face scrutiny. Villagers who had been lifelong friends found themselves quarreling in the market square. The postmistress declared Harold a guardian of truth. The schoolmaster countered that he was a fraud who had betrayed the town's trust. And all the while, the parish volumes remained missing. Evidence emerges. Meanwhile, the county records office examined other books from the Marlowe Library. Their findings were damning. Annotations in the same hand appeared across multiple volumes, from parish histories to trade ledgers. Entire footnotes cited pamphlets that had never existed. One particularly bold claim appeared in a ledger from 1644, suggesting that Oliver Cromwell himself had visited Marlowe disguised as a wool merchant. The handwriting matched the contested notes in the parish volumes. The evidence pointed to a single author, Harold Sykes. A visit to his lodgings. Investigators searched Harold's lodgings, a modest flat above a grocer's shop. There they found stacks of loose papers, many filled with his careful, looping script. Among them were draft footnotes, entire passages copied in pencil before being inserted into library volumes. The drafts were riddled with erasures and corrections. One page contained a trial sentence. It is said King Charles passed through Marlowe in 1643, then struck through. Beneath it, rewritten in firmer hand, it is known King Charles passed through Marlowe in 1643. The progression from suggestion to assertion was clear. Harold had not simply preserved history, he had invented it. The scholars respond. When these drafts were revealed, scholars in Sheffield and Nottingham published their findings. Academic journals carried headlines such as "The Marlowe Fabrications" and "False Footnotes and Falsified Histories." The scandal spread beyond the county, becoming a cautionary tale in academic circles. To many, Harold became a symbol of provincial ambition, gone astray a librarian who tried to rewrite history to elevate his town. But in Marlowe itself, the revelations only hardened the divide. His defenders insisted the drafts were misunderstood, rough notes rather than forgeries. His detractors felt vindicated, certain he had deceived them all. Margaret's doubts. Caught in the middle was Margaret Poole. As Harold's assistant, she had admired his devotion to books, but now she began to wonder. She recalled moments when he had lingered over the parish volumes after hours, his pencil scratching quietly. She remembered catching him once erasing a margin, only for him to wave it off as correction. The more she thought, the more uneasy she grew. And yet she hesitated to speak publicly. Loyalty warred with suspicion. In a town tearing itself apart, Margaret feared her words might make her an enemy to both sides. A breakthrough. In early 1959, months after Harold's disappearance, a break came. A railway porter in Leicester reported a man matching Harold's description had left a heavy trunk at the station's left luggage counter. The trunk had remained unclaimed. When opened by police, it contained 3 of the missing parish volumes. Inside, further annotations were discovered freshly written, in pencil, unmistakably Harold's hand. The evidence was overwhelming. Harold had not only forged the past, but had continued his work even after the scandal broke. The hunt narrows. With this discovery, the search for Harold intensified. Police circulated his description more widely. His photo appeared in newspapers under headlines such as "Runaway Librarian Sought in Forgery Scandal." Some villagers were horrified to see his face in print. Others felt betrayed, convinced at last that their trusted librarian was indeed a fraud. And still, Harold remained elusive. The cliffhanger. One cold evening in March, nearly a year after the first suspicions arose, Constable Toller received a telegram from London. It stated simply, "Harold Sykes apprehended. Found attempting to sell annotated volume at antiquarian bookshop. Being returned to Derbyshire for questioning." The librarian who had once been the quiet guardian of Marlowe's history was now a prisoner, accused of rewriting it. But when Harold was brought back in handcuffs, villagers pressed against the railings, shouting both insults and encouragement. Some saw a criminal, others a martyr. And Harold, looking out through his spectacles, said only one cryptic phrase, "I did it for Marlowe." By the summer of 1959, The case of Harold Sykes had become a curious spectacle. In Derby Crown Court, where trials of thieves, smugglers, and occasional violent offenders usually filled the docket, a librarian charged with forgery seemed almost absurd. Yet the public gallery was packed, not with hardened criminals' families, but with scholars, journalists, and villagers who had taken the train to watch their fate bound up in Harold's. The charge was not theft, but tampering with historical records, and offense under the Public Records Acts. In essence, Harold stood accused of falsifying documents entrusted to his care. He appeared frail as he entered, spectacles perched on his nose, hands trembling as he adjusted his jacket. To many in Marlow, it was a shock. This was the same man who had once shelved books with quiet dignity, now stepping into the dock like a common criminal. The prosecution's case. The prosecution laid out its evidence with precision. Parish volumes recovered from Harold's trunk, bearing fresh annotations in his hand. Draft footnotes discovered in his lodgings, showing the evolution of fabricated claims. Expert testimony from archivists and handwriting analysts, linking the marginal notes across dozens of books to Harold himself. Most damning of all was the deliberate progression of invention. Scholars testified how vague suggestions, it is said, had been reshaped into firm declarations, it is known, transforming speculation into supposed fact. This was no accident, the prosecutor declared. It was a calculated attempt to rewrite history. Harold's defense. Harold's solicitor, a weary man unused to such peculiar cases, tried to mount a defense. He argued that Harold had not forged, but interpreted that his marginalia were not fabrications but speculative glosses, a tradition as old as scholarship itself. Harold himself, when called to speak, was more passionate. He insisted he had acted for Marlow, to preserve its dignity in a world where small towns were forgotten. What harm is there, he asked the court, in recording what might have been? Our town deserves a place in history. If scholars will not look for it, then I will show them where to find it. But his words, meant to inspire, only underscored the prosecution's point. He had deliberately blurred the line between fact and invention. The verdict. After a week of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The verdict, guilty. Harold was sentenced to 2 years, imprisonment a relatively light term, reflecting both his age and the nonviolent nature of his crime. Yet for a man who had lived among books and quiet rooms, prison was a devastating sentence. Reaction in Marlow. The verdict split Marlow down the middle. Some villagers felt vindicated, relieved that the shame of forgery had been laid bare. He made us fools, one shopkeeper muttered. All those scholars laughing at us now. Others clung to Harold's defense, portraying him as a man sacrificed to academic arrogance. The postmistress even pinned a letter of support to the library door, signed by dozens of locals, declaring Harold our true historian. The divide lingered long after the trial. Families quarreled. The village fair that year was subdued, and the library itself, once a sanctuary, became a place of uneasy silence. The academic world. In scholarly circles, the case became infamous. Journals dissected the Marlow forgeries for years, debating not only Harold's motives, but the ease with which falsehoods had slipped into historical discourse. Professors used the case as a cautionary tale in lectures, a reminder that even trusted sources must be scrutinized, that footnotes are not infallible, and that passion for one's hometown is no substitute for evidence. Harold's decline. Harold served his sentence quietly. Reports from prison described him as withdrawn, spending hours in the library, speaking little. When released in 1961, he returned briefly to Marlow but found the town changed. Some greeted him with hostility, others with awkward pity. Unable to resume his post at the library, he lived quietly with a cousin in Nottingham, where he died a few years later, his name never fully cleared. The legacy. The parish volumes, once central to the town's pride, were transferred to the county records office, where they remain to this day. They are still consulted not for their contents, but as artifacts of the scandal. Margins once meant to elevate Marlow are now studied as examples of forgery. In the years that followed, Marlow-on-Trent saw fewer tourists than Harold had hoped. Its river ferries dwindled, its market shrank. To outsiders, it was just another small town. But to historians, it carried an odd fame, not for kings or battles, but for a librarian who tried to manufacture them. Reflection. What makes Harold's crime so striking is not its scale. No great treasure was stolen. No lives were lost. It is that he tampered with something more delicate, trust in the written word. History depends on records, and records depend on custodians. When those custodians blur fact with fiction, the past itself trembles. Harold Sykes, forgeries remind us that even in the quietest corners among dust, ink, and silence, crime can flourish, reshaping memory itself. And so, the tale of Marlow's librarian leaves us with an uncomfortable question. How many other histories rest on margins we have never thought to doubt? Story 3. The grocery clerk who embezzled pennies. In the industrial Midlands of the early 1970s, the town of Brackley was much like many others, rows of terraced houses, the low hum of factories, and a high street where local shops clung to survival against the looming threat of expanding supermarkets. Among the shops stood Warren's Grocers, a family-owned establishment that had survived 2 world wars, rationing, and the slow shift from small-scale retail to chain dominance. Its proprietor, Arthur Warren, was a stout man in his 50s, known for his tidy aprons and strict bookkeeping. For Arthur, every tin of beans, every penny in change was accounted for. But it was his insistence on precision that led him to notice something peculiar. The till never quite balanced. The clerk. The grocer employed 3 clerks. 2 were part-time women from the neighborhood who came in mornings to help with stocking and wrapping parcels. The third was a young man named Colin Harper, 23, a quiet sort with thick glasses and a neat manner. Colin had started at Warren straight from school, and though he lacked ambition, he was reliable. He arrived early, stacked shelves diligently, and minded the till without complaint. Customers liked him, for he was polite and remembered regulars, preferences sugar cubes over granulated, margarine over butter, that sort of thing. Yet behind Colin's neat exterior, there was a restlessness that few suspected. The pennies. It began with the smallest discrepancies. At the end of a day's trade, the till might be 3 pence short or 5. Arthur assumed it was error, a miscounted coin, a slip in giving change. But as weeks turned into months, the pattern persisted. Always short, never over. Always pennies, never pounds. Arthur, meticulous as ever, began keeping closer watch. He reconciled receipts nightly, counted coins twice. Still, the losses continued. By summer of 1972, the missing sums added up to several pounds, not enough to bankrupt a grocer, but enough to gnaw at Arthur's sense of order. Suspicion. Arthur's suspicions turned naturally to his clerks. The women, long-trusted neighbors, seemed unlikely culprits. Colin, though polite, was younger, quieter, and more difficult to read. Arthur began to watch him more closely, noting the way his hands lingered on the till, the slight delay before coins were dropped into the drawer. Still, there was no proof. Colin's circumstances. To understand the crime, one must understand Colin. He lived with his mother in a narrow terrace on Brook Street. His father, once a machinist, had died young of lung disease. His mother stitched garments at home, her earnings modest. Colin had dreams of more, of music records, better clothes, perhaps even saving for a motorbike. But his wages at the grocer barely covered necessities. Temptation did not come in great heists or schemes, but in the quiet presence of coins slipping through his fingers. A penny held back here, a halfpenny there. At first it was almost accidental, then deliberate. Small enough not to be missed in the moment, small enough to justify to himself. Only a few coppers. Mr. Warren won't notice. But Arthur did notice. The trap. By September, Arthur decided to set a trap. He placed marked coins in the till pennies with tiny scratches on their edges, recorded carefully in his ledger. That evening, when the till again came up short, he searched Colin's coat pockets before locking up. Nothing. But when Arthur checked the collection box in the parish hall the following Sunday, where Colin often volunteered, he spotted one of the scratched pennies among the coins. It was coincidence perhaps, but to Arthur it was proof. Still, accusation was dangerous. To accuse without evidence risked reputation for both master and clerk. Arthur needed certainty. Watching the clerk. So Arthur watched more closely. He lingered at the counter, pretending to arrange produce while Colin rang purchases. He checked the till midday, counting receipts against coins. Each time the difference was subtle but real. And Colin, sensing the scrutiny, grew nervous. His hands trembled slightly as he gave change. His eyes flickered toward Arthur with unease. It was no longer just missing pennies. It was a quiet battle between suspicion and concealment, fought daily over the grocer's counter. Customers began to notice the tension. Mrs. Pratt, who bought tea leaves every Wednesday, remarked on the strained silence between master and clerk. Mr. Dixon, the butcher's boy, joked that Arthur counted coins like a miser. The gossip reached the ears of the town. Soon people whispered, "Something's not right at Warren." The escalation. What began with pennies escalated. Perhaps emboldened, perhaps desperate, Colin began holding back larger sums, sixpence, a shilling. Still modest, but enough for Arthur to calculate the theft now at more than £10 in total. £10 in 1972 was no fortune, but it was enough to mark betrayal. Arthur considered dismissal, but pride stopped him. To dismiss without exposing would mean swallowing the loss. To expose without proof would risk slander. He resolved to catch Colin in the act. The ledger trick. Arthur devised another trap. He asked Colin to tally the day's receipts while he himself counted the cash separately. That evening, their tallies differed by exactly 1 shilling. Arthur confronted him. "Colin," he said quietly, "the till is short again. Always short, never over. How do you explain it?" Colin's face reddened. He stammered about mistakes, about being tired, about coins slipping. But Arthur, staring at him over the counter, saw guilt flicker plainly. "You'll explain it in writing," Arthur said firmly. He handed him a slip of paper, demanding an account of the missing sums. Colin scribbled nervously, producing an explanation of arithmetic error. It was unconvincing. Arthur folded the paper, slid it into his ledger, and said nothing more, for the moment. The town's unease. By October, the matter could not remain private. Word of Arthur's suspicions seeped into the town, carried in whispers at the factory gates and murmurs at the pub. Some pitied Arthur, whose reputation for honesty was being tested. Others pitied Colin, who was young and poor, perhaps only foolish rather than wicked. The division grew sharper when a rumor spread that Arthur planned to involve the police. An unresolved moment. One evening, as Arthur closed the shop, he lingered by the till, his fingers resting on the brass handle. The drawer, innocent in appearance, had become a symbol of betrayal. He looked across at Colin, who stood silently sweeping the floor, his shoulders hunched. Arthur knew that the next step, whether dismissal, confrontation, or calling in the constable, would change everything. But which would he choose? Arthur Warren was not a man given to rashness. For weeks he had turned the matter over in his mind, balancing the scales of proof and suspicion. To accuse without certainty could ruin a young man's life. To remain silent would erode his own integrity and the integrity of the shop that bore his family's name. By November of 1972, he could delay no longer. The till was short nearly every night, the losses mounting. What had begun as a handful of coppers now tallied to more than 15 pounds, a sum Arthur could not explain away to his books. So one Tuesday evening, after the shutters were drawn and the shop swept clean, Arthur turned to Colin Harper and said, with quiet firmness, "Sit down, lad, we've something to settle." The accusation. Colin obeyed reluctantly, lowering himself onto the wooden stool behind the counter. Arthur set the day's ledger on the table and opened the till drawer with deliberate slowness. "Do you see these figures?" Arthur asked, tapping the page. "The receipts and the stock tallies, they do not match the cash. They haven't matched for months." Colin shifted, adjusting his glasses. I suppose I've made errors," he mumbled. Arthur shook his head. "Errors sometimes favor the shop, sometimes not. But this drawer is never over, Colin, always short. That's no mistake." The silence stretched. Outside, the rattle of a milk cart echoed faintly, the town already settling for the night. Finally, Colin whispered, "It's only pennies." The words hung in the air like confession. The justification. Colin's voice grew steadier as he tried to explain. He spoke of long hours, meager wages, his mother's bills. He insisted he never meant harm, only to take what went unnoticed. Arthur listened, arms folded, face stern. The young man's excuses did not soften him. "Pennies add to pounds," Arthur said coldly. "You've not stolen from me alone, Colin. You've stolen from every customer who trusted this counter, from the name over the door, from yourself most of all." The next step. Arthur considered his choices. He could dismiss Colin quietly, sending him away with shame but without record. Or he could involve the constable, making the matter public a scandal in a town where gossip spread faster than smoke. He told Colin he would think on it overnight. But Colin, pale and trembling, knew the reprieve was thin. The constable arrives. The following morning, Arthur went to see Constable Peter Lowry, a lean, methodical man who had served Brackley for 2 decades. Lowry listened gravely as Arthur laid out the missing sums, the marked coins, and Colin's whispered admission. "It may seem small," Arthur concluded, "but it is theft nonetheless, and theft unpunished breeds worse." Constable Lowry agreed. He accompanied Arthur back to the shop that afternoon and asked Colin to account for himself. Colin, caught between denial and confession, faltered. When Lowry pressed him, he admitted quietly that he had taken a few coins now and then. It was enough. Lowry noted the admission and informed Colin he would need to come down to the station. The town reacts. By evening, word had spread. In a town of Brackley's size, nothing remained private long. Customers arrived the next day whispering about the boy from the grocer who had been taken to the station. Some shook their heads in disappointment. Others muttered that Arthur had been too harsh, that a few pennies were not worth ruining a life. But Arthur, though unsettled by the town's chatter, stood firm. To him, the issue was not the money but the principle. The investigation. At the station, Constable Lowry examined the evidence with care. He compared Arthur's ledgers with the till receipts, tallying the discrepancies. He interviewed Colin at length, pressing him on how long the skimming had gone on. Colin admitted to taking small amounts for more than a year. "It was never much," he insisted. "A halfpenny here, a shilling there. I thought it would go unnoticed." But the records told otherwise. The total loss exceeded 20 pounds, a considerable sum in a shop where margins were thin. The charge. The case, though minor compared to robberies or assaults, was sufficient for a charge of embezzlement. Colin was summoned before the magistrate, his name printed in the local paper under the stark headline, "Clerk charged in till theft." The shame was swift. His mother, who had depended on his wages, wept openly in the street. Neighbors avoided their eyes. Customers who once greeted him warmly now whispered about his betrayal. Arthur's conflict. Arthur Warren, though resolute, felt a pang of guilt. He had sought justice, but now he saw the ruin it brought. A boy who might have been corrected with stern words was now branded a thief. At night, he sat by his ledger and wondered if he had chosen rightly. Yet when he thought of the shop's reputation, of the customers who trusted him, his conviction returned. A grocer's honor, he muttered to himself, is measured in pennies. The escalation. As the magistrate's hearing approached, rumors swirled. Some claimed Colin had taken far more than 20 pounds, perhaps hidden away in secret. Others whispered that he had gambled the money in backroom card games. Constable Lowry found no evidence of gambling, but he did discover that Colin had purchased several new records, a second-hand suit, and even made a deposit toward a motorbike. The purchases were modest but suspicious given his wages. The suggestion that stolen pennies had funded luxuries hardened public opinion. What sympathy some had felt began to fade. Colin's desperation. Colin, awaiting his hearing, grew desperate. He begged Arthur to withdraw the complaint, promising to repay every penny. He swore he had learned his lesson, that he would never betray trust again. Arthur listened but remained unmoved. "It is beyond my hands now," he said. "The law must decide." Colin left, his face stricken. The cliffhanger. On the eve of the hearing, Constable Lowry made a troubling discovery. Among Colin's belongings at home, tucked inside a record sleeve, he found not only coins but a handful of pound notes. Where had they come from? Arthur's records showed missing sums of pennies and shillings, never full notes. Had Colin taken more than he admitted? Had he found another source of money? The constable holding the notes frowned. The case, simple at first glance, now carried a deeper question. Had the grocery clerk been stealing only pennies, or was there more to the story than anyone had realized? On a cold December morning in 1972, the Brackley Magistrates' Court filled with townsfolk eager to witness the hearing. It was rare that local justice involved more than petty disputes or licensing matters. A clerk accused of embezzlement from Warren's grocers was the most excitement the town had seen in months. The courtroom smelled faintly of coal smoke and damp wool. Colin Harper stood at the front, pale and drawn, spectacles slipping down his nose. Beside him sat a duty solicitor, leafing through notes with weary detachment. Across the aisle, Arthur Warren sat upright, ledger in hand, his jaw tight with resolve. Constable Lowry laid out the case. The shortages, the marked coins, the admissions, and finally the pound notes discovered in Colin's possession. The prosecution's case. The prosecution emphasized not the scale of the theft, but its persistence. This was not a single mistake, they argued, but a pattern daily skimming that over time became significant. Trust, the prosecutor intoned, is the coin of any business. Mr. Harper has eroded that trust penny by penny until it collapsed entirely. The pound notes, though unproven to be stolen from the shop, were paraded as circumstantial evidence of Colin's dishonesty. If he could pocket coins, why not notes? Colin's defense. Colin's solicitor argued that the amounts were trivial, that his client was young and foolish, not malicious. He reminded the magistrates that Colin had cared for his widowed mother, that temptation was easy in poverty. Colin himself spoke haltingly. "I never meant to cause harm," he said. "I only thought of small things, a record, a treat. I thought it wouldn't be missed." But his words, intended as apology, came across instead as confirmation of deliberate theft. The verdict. After brief deliberation, the magistrates returned their decision: guilty. Colin was sentenced to 3 months in prison, followed by a year of probation. The sentence was light compared to larger thefts, but heavy enough to mark him. For in a small town, a conviction was not measured in months, but in memory, and memory lingered long after the jail doors closed. The fallout. Arthur Warren returned to his shop the next day, ledger balanced, but his reputation bore strange scars. Some praised him for upholding honesty. Others muttered that he had destroyed a young man's life over pennies. Custom at Warren's declined for a time. A few loyal customers remained steadfast, but others drifted toward the new supermarket that had opened on the edge of town. Arthur himself was unrepentant. A shop that excuses theft, he told a neighbor, is no shop at all. Yet when he sat alone at night, he sometimes wondered if he had done justice or only preserved pride. Colin's struggle. For Colin, prison was grim. He served his 3 months quietly, keeping to himself, reading old library books when he could. Upon release, he returned to his mother's terrace, shunned by neighbors who once greeted him kindly. He sought work but found none. No shop would hire a clerk branded as a thief. Factory work eluded him too. The conviction followed him like a shadow. Some said he left Brackley within a year, seeking anonymity in the sprawl of Birmingham. Others whispered he fell into worse company, his small crime becoming the first step down a darker path. A crime, remember. In Brackley, the story of the embezzling clerk became a cautionary tale. Parents told children, "It begins with pennies," shopkeepers muttered. "Balance your tills or you'll end like Warren." The scandal lingered long after the sums were forgotten. People no longer spoke of the exact shilling stolen, but of the lesson. Betrayal of trust, however small, corrodes more than the books it corrodes the bonds of community. Reflection. Looking back, what strikes us is not the amount stolen, but the ripple it created. £20 in coins would not change a grocer's fortunes, yet it fractured a town's sense of trust. A boy's yearning for more for music, clothes, a motorbike became the spark for public shame. It reminds us how crimes need not be grand to matter. A clerk's fingers brushing too often against coins can alter reputations, livelihoods, even the course of a life. Closing thought. And so, the tale of the grocery clerk ends with a truth as stark as any highway robbery. Theft measured in pennies carries the weight of betrayal measured in tons. It leaves us to wonder how many lives have been altered not by fortune stolen in the night, but by the quiet disappearance of a few coins, day after day. Story 4. The Vanishing Typewriters of County Hall. In the mid-1960s, County Hall in Staffordshire stood as a monument to civic order. A stately Edwardian building of red brick and stone trim, it housed the county council offices, chambers where debates about road repairs, school budgets, and drainage projects filled the air with the dull hum of local government. To most residents, County Hall was a place of paperwork and propriety. Inside, rows of clerks tapped away at typewriters, producing minutes, ledgers, and letters. The clatter of keys was as constant as birdsong outside the windows. Typewriters then were not luxuries but the lifeblood of the office. Each department had its quota, each machine logged and maintained. They were heavy, iron-framed beasts under Woods, Remingtons, Olivettis not easily carried or concealed. And yet, in 1965, County Hall faced a problem both absurd and troubling. Typewriters were disappearing. The first missing machine. The first absence was dismissed as oversight. In the education department, a clerk named Mr. Dempsey noticed that the Olivetti from the corner desk was gone. His supervisor assumed it had been sent for repair, but when maintenance denied receiving it, confusion spread. The machine was logged as present in the last inventory, and yet it was nowhere to be found. A single typewriter could be misplaced, perhaps in the shuffle of offices, but 2 weeks later, another was missing, this time from the highways department, then another from accounts. By the third disappearance, jokes gave way to unease. Typewriters did not vanish like pencils. They weighed 40 pounds, clanked when moved, and required 2 hands to carry. Someone, it seemed, was stealing them. The problem of absurdity. The theft struck many as absurd. Who would want to steal office typewriters? They were bulky, outdated, and traceable by serial number. And yet, their value was undeniable. On the open market, a second-hand Olivetti could fetch several pounds, enough to tempt someone of modest means. But how could thieves remove them from County Hall unnoticed? Porters manned the doors, clerks bustled daily, and the machines themselves were chained, in some cases, to desks. The puzzle gripped the staff. Some suspected external burglars. Others whispered that the culprit must be internal, a clerk or porter, moving unnoticed among familiar corridors. Suspicion within. As the disappearances mounted, suspicion spread. Clerks eyed one another warily. Did the quiet man from records slip away with a machine under a canvas bag? Did the cleaning staff with access at night spirit them out in carts? The council chairman, red-faced with embarrassment, demanded answers. "If we cannot keep track of our typewriters," he thundered, "how can we expect the public to trust us with their roads and schools?" The audit. In response, the county treasurer ordered a full audit. Every typewriter in the building was to be inspected, logged, and checked against serial numbers. Clerks lined up their machines, supervisors ticked boxes, and maintenance staff peered at the brass plates. The results were shocking. Not 3 machines were missing, but 8. Some had vanished weeks earlier, unnoticed in the shuffle of office life. The problem was not isolated, it was systemic. The constable's investigation. Local police were called. Constable Frederick Miles, a young officer with a taste for puzzles, was assigned the case. He interviewed clerks, inspected doors and locks, and searched storage rooms. His first observation was simple. No locks had been forced, no windows broken. The machines had not been carried out in haste, but removed with calm familiarity. This was not burglary, he told the council chairman. This was inside work. Theories abound. Theories bloomed like weeds. Some suggested a clerk supplementing wages by selling typewriters to second-hand shops. Others imagined a broader conspiracy. Stolen machines funneled into black markets, perhaps even abroad. One rumor claimed the machines were being smuggled into schools, where underfunded headmasters welcomed them gratefully. Another suggested they had been spirited into private businesses run by relatives of clerks. Each theory carried a seed of plausibility, yet none explained how the thefts had gone unnoticed so long. A breakthrough. Constable Miles, methodical in his work, began checking local pawn shops. After days of fruitless inquiry, he struck gold. A Remington typewriter, serial number filed off but still faintly legible, matching one missing from County Hall. The shopkeeper claimed he had purchased it from a man in his 40s, wearing a porter's cap. Paid cash, no receipt. The description fit several men employed at County Hall. It was not proof, but it was a lead. The porters under scrutiny. Attention turned to the porters, the men who moved equipment, carried parcels, and manned the doors. They alone could carry typewriters in and out without arousing suspicion. A porter with a machine under his arm might appear merely to be relocating it. The idea unsettled the council. To suspect the very men trusted with the building's security was humiliating. Yet the evidence pointed inexorably their way. Unease in the hall. By early winter, morale in County Hall had collapsed. Clerks locked drawers unnecessarily, eyeing colleagues as potential thieves. The joke of vanishing typewriters became a bitter refrain. And still the machines disappeared. By Christmas, the tally had risen to 12. An unresolved puzzle. Constable Miles stood in the echoing corridors one evening, staring at the rows of desks. How could so many typewriters vanish, one by one, in a building always full of eyes? He suspected the answer lay not in the machines themselves, but in the habits of the staff. Somewhere in the rhythm of County Hall's daily life was the cover a thief needed. But what rhythm, what gap? The typewriters were gone, but the pattern of their disappearance had yet to be uncovered. Constable Frederick Miles returned to County Hall in January of 1966 with a notebook under his arm and determination in his stride. The council chairman, his patience exhausted, demanded results. "This has made us a laughingstock," he barked. "If clerks cannot hold onto their typewriters, what faith has the public in our accounts?" Miles, younger than most of the clerks he questioned, was methodical rather than intimidating. He began by mapping the disappearances, dates, departments, and times when the machines were last seen. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The vanishings clustered around the end of the workday, often just before weekends or holidays. And almost always, the missing machines had been located near corridors leading toward the porter's lodge. The porters under the lamp. The porters were called in for questioning. They were a varied group, middle-aged men with stout bellies, younger lads earning steady wages, and one veteran of the war who limped from an old wound. When asked if they had seen anything unusual, they shook their heads. Typewriters, they reminded Miles, were heavy but not impossible to move. They often carried them to repair shops or shuffled them between offices. Any man with a pass and a porter's cart could wheel one out, and no one would bat an eye, one admitted. That was precisely the problem. The role of porters gave perfect cover, yet no man confessed, and Miles had no witness to prove otherwise. A false lead. Word of the investigation spread beyond County Hall. A week later, a tip came from a second-hand dealer in Birmingham, claiming to have purchased 3 typewriters matching the missing descriptions. Miles traveled to inspect them. But the machines, though similar, bore no connection to County Hall. Their serial numbers did not match. The lead collapsed, wasting precious days. Rumors followed quickly that Miles was chasing shadows, that perhaps no theft had occurred at all, that the machines were simply shuffled between departments and badly logged. The clerk's diary. It was then that a clerk from the accounts department, Mrs. Glover, approached Miles privately. She had kept a personal diary of office comings and goings. On 2 dates matching typewriter disappearances, she noted the same observation: a porter named Henry Lowe leaving early, wheeling a covered cart toward the rear entrance. Henry Lowe was a quiet man in his 40s, widowed, who kept largely to himself. He was well-liked but not intimately known. When questioned, Lowe denied wrongdoing. He insisted the cart contained waste paper bound for disposal, but when Miles checked the disposal records, no such collections were logged on the dates in question. Suspicion deepened. A council divided. The council members themselves grew divided. Some wanted immediate dismissal of Lowe and other porters, fearing scandal. Others urged caution, wary of punishing men without proof. In the public house across the street, clerks muttered that the council would rather protect its own than find the truth. The atmosphere in County Hall grew poisonous. Porters and clerks eyed one another like rival factions. Morale collapsed further. Following the machines, Miles changed strategy. Rather than interrogate men, he traced machines. He learned that typewriters, even second-hand, carried distinct serials. He sent notices to pawn shops, resellers, and even schools across Staffordshire. Weeks later, a reply arrived from a shop in Stoke-on-Trent. A Remington, serial number partially defaced, had been purchased from a man matching a porter's build. The shopkeeper could not identify the man beyond average height, cap pulled low. But the handwriting on the pawn slip shaky, slanted bore a resemblance to Henry Lowe's. Miles felt he was closing in. A sudden twist. Then came an unexpected development. Another typewriter disappeared, this time from the planning department. But Henry Lowe was away that day, signed off ill with influenza. The theft, instead of narrowing suspicion, widened it again. Could there be more than one thief? Was Lowe innocent after all? The meeting. Constable Miles gathered the porters in the Great Hall one evening after hours. He laid out the evidence: the machines missing, the pawn shop lead, the diary entries. Then he said, calmly but firmly, "These machines are not vanishing into thin air. They are carried out by men who know these halls. If it continues, I will have no choice but to search every cart, every bag, and every man." The porters shifted uneasily. One, younger and hot-tempered, protested, "You can't treat us like criminals." Another muttered that the council paid them too little to guard treasures so carelessly. But one man, Henry Lowe, remained silent, staring at the floor. A hidden door. In his frustration, Miles expanded his search of County Hall itself. While inspecting a disused records room in the basement, he noticed scuff marks on the stone floor, as though heavy objects had been dragged recently. Behind a stack of broken furniture, he discovered a small door leading to a coal chute, once used before central heating was installed. The chute opened onto a narrow alley at the rear of the building, an exit invisible from the porter's lodge. It was the perfect escape route. Had the thief been wheeling typewriters not through the main doors, but out this forgotten passage? The cliffhanger. Miles arranged for the chute to be watched discreetly. Days passed with no incident. Then, late one Friday evening, a watchman reported movement. A cart rattling down the basement corridor, pushed by a man with his cap pulled low. The watchman swore it was Henry Lowe. But when Miles rushed to intercept, the corridor was empty, the cart abandoned, and the chute door ajar. The typewriter on the cart, an Olivetti, was gone. Someone had slipped into the night again. The failed interception in the basement unsettled Constable Miles. He knew now that the coal chute was the escape route, yet he had no solid proof of who used it. So, in February 1966, he arranged a proper stakeout. 2 plainclothes officers took turns hidden in the alley outside, while Miles himself lingered in the basement corridor at dusk, ears straining for the rattle of a cart. For nearly a week, nothing happened. Clerks and porters went about their days, nervous but quiet. The missing machines remained the talk of the town, the local paper dubbing it the case of the vanishing typewriters. Then, on a Thursday evening, footsteps echoed in the basement. A porter's cart squeaked on its wheels. Miles held his breath as a figure in cap and overcoat pushed a covered load toward the coal chute. When Miles stepped out of the shadows, torchlight catching the man's face, there was no mistaking him. Henry Lowe. The arrest. Lowe froze, then bolted. But the cart, heavy with its iron cargo, slowed him. Miles lunged, grabbing his arm. The struggle was brief, the clatter of the typewriter echoing as it toppled to the stone floor. Within minutes, other officers arrived. Lowe was arrested on the spot, the stolen Olivetti as damning evidence. Under questioning at the station, he denied everything at first, insisting he had been moving old scrap. But when confronted with pawnshop slips, diary notes, and now the typewriter seized from his cart, his denial collapsed. At last he confessed. The method. The scheme had been simple, almost embarrassingly so. Lowe had discovered the disused coal chute months earlier while cleaning the basement. Realizing it led to an alley with little foot traffic, he saw opportunity. He began wheeling typewriters from offices under the pretense of maintenance, covering them with sacks. At night, when most staff had left, he dragged them to the chute, slid them into the alley, and retrieved them later with the help of a borrowed handcart. To avoid suspicion, he spaced the thefts weeks apart, targeting different departments each time. The lack of clear inventory checks had aided him. By the time anyone noticed, the machines were already sold. The motive. Why typewriters? Money. Lowe's wages as a porter barely covered rent and food. A second-hand typewriter fetched £5 to £10 on the market, nearly a week's pay for him. Selling them through pawn shops and resellers, he supplemented his income steadily. But there was pride, too. Lowe admitted feeling invisible in County Hall, treated as little more than a servant by the clerks. Each theft, he said, gave him a sense of cleverness, proof that he could outwit those who looked down on him. The trial. The case went to trial in April. The courtroom was crowded, not with hardened criminals but with clerks, councilmen, and curious townsfolk who wanted to see justice for the scandal that had embarrassed their county. The prosecution presented clear evidence: the recovered machines, the pawn slips, and testimony from Mrs. Glover and the pawn shop owner. Lowe's defense argued desperation, painting him as a poor widower supplementing meager wages. His solicitor emphasized the absurdity of the crime: not jewels or money, but clunky office machines. The jury, however, was unmoved. They found him guilty of theft and fraud. Lowe was sentenced to 18 months in prison. Reaction in County Hall. The verdict brought relief but not pride. County Hall had been made a public laughingstock, its inability to protect typewriters mocked in newspapers as far away as London. Within the building, reforms followed quickly. Inventories were tightened, serial numbers logged more carefully, and porters' movements more closely supervised. The coal chute was bricked up, its usefulness as an exit now forever tainted. But the damage to morale lingered. Clerks felt exposed, their routines mocked. Porters felt mistrusted, even those with spotless records. The camaraderie of County Hall, once dull but steady, never fully returned. Lowe's fate. Henry Lowe served his sentence quietly. Reports suggested he took little part in prison life, keeping to himself much as he had in County Hall. When released, he did not return to Staffordshire but vanished into obscurity, perhaps seeking work under a different name. Some said he ended up in Manchester, working in a warehouse. Others claimed he emigrated, chasing a new start abroad. In truth, his name faded from memory, except as a footnote in County Hall's records. Reflection. The theft of typewriters might sound almost comic: absurd machines lugged through corridors, dragged down coal chutes. Yet the crime cut deeper than its object. It revealed the fragility of institutions, how easily trust could be broken from within. It also showed the quiet resentments that fester in bureaucracies, the invisible labor of porters, the arrogance of clerks, the loneliness of men like Lowe. His thefts were not just for money, but for a fleeting sense of control in a life otherwise bound by drudgery. Closing thought. So ended the scandal of the vanishing typewriters, not with a grand revelation, but with the arrest of a solitary porter slipping machines through a forgotten door. It leaves us to wonder, in every institution, what hidden chutes still exist, waiting for someone overlooked and embittered to find them. Story 5. The Coal Merchant's Secret Ledgers. In the years after World War II, coal was not merely fuel, it was lifeblood. In towns across England, from Yorkshire to Kent, coal merchants were fixtures of daily life. They were men with sooty hands and heavy sacks, driving horse-drawn carts and later lorries down narrow streets, delivering the black lumps that heated homes, cooked meals, and powered small factories. In the town of Harrowford, a modest industrial settlement in the north, the coal trade was dominated by one man, Ernest Pritchard, proprietor of Pritchard & Sons Fuel Supply. His yard on Mill Lane was a noisy, dusty place, scales creaking, men shouting, sacks thudding. The Pritchard lorries, painted with the family name in bold letters, were familiar sights rattling through cobbled streets. Pritchard had inherited the business from his father, expanding it after nationalization of the coal industry in 1947. While the mines themselves were under government control, merchants like Pritchard handled distribution, supplying households and small businesses under tightly regulated quotas and prices. Coal meant money, and where money mixed with rationing and regulation, temptation always lurked. The merchant. Ernest Pritchard was a large man, broad-shouldered, with a booming laugh that carried across the yard. Customers described him as affable, even generous. He often gave credit to families struggling through winter, letting them pay weeks later. But beneath the jovial exterior was a shrewd businessman. Ernest knew every ton of coal that entered his yard, every sack that left. He kept ledgers meticulously, or so it seemed. The first suspicion. It began with a factory manager, Mr. Leslie Grant, who ran a small textile works on the edge of town. He noticed that his coal deliveries from Pritchard seemed lighter than paid for. His boilers consumed fuel faster than expected, and though invoices claimed 5 tons delivered, he suspected it was less. At first, Grant chalked it up to error, but when the discrepancy recurred month after month, his suspicion deepened. He began weighing his deliveries. One lorry marked 5 tons contained only 4.5. Another, supposedly 3 tons, held barely 2 3/4. Grant raised the matter with Ernest, who laughed it off. "Scales are tricky things, Mr. Grant. Coal settles. Maybe your men miscounted." But Grant was not convinced. The Whisper Network. Word spread quietly among Harrowford's businesses. A baker mentioned that his deliveries too seemed light. A publican swore his last consignment barely lasted half the month. Housewives muttered that their sacks emptied faster than usual. Soon whispers circulated. Pritchard was cheating. But how? His ledgers were immaculate, his scales certified. Customers signed for deliveries without fuss. The coal arrived, dusty and heavy, impossible to check easily in the street. The scales. Attention turned to the weighbridge at Pritchard's yard. Every lorry passed across it, coal measured by ton before leaving. Inspectors certified it regularly. Yet some wondered, could the machine itself be rigged? A retired miner suggested Ernest had arranged for the scales to stick, shaving off weight undetected. Another claimed sacks were underfilled at the yard before being tied shut. But when the council inspected the weighbridge in late 1950s, it passed without issue. The scales were accurate. Officially, nothing was wrong. The secret ledger. The breakthrough came not from inspectors, but from one of Ernest's own clerks, a young man named Harold Evans. Harold, tasked with copying invoices, noticed discrepancies between 2 sets of books. One ledger, neatly bound, was shown to auditors and inspectors. Another, a dog-eared notebook kept in Ernest's desk, contained different figures, altered weights, adjusted prices, and names of customers who appeared only by initials. At first, Harold assumed it was some private record, but when he compared entries, he realized the second ledger told the true story. Consignments consistently shorted, profits pocketed, and payments made off the books. Pritchard, it seemed, kept 2 sets of records, one for the authorities, another for himself. The clerk's dilemma. Harold was troubled. He admired Pritchard, who had given him steady employment, yet he could not ignore the fraud. At night, he confided in his father, a retired railwayman. His father's response was blunt. "If he's robbing folk, he's no better than a thief. You can't sit on it, lad." But to expose Pritchard meant risking his own job, even his safety. The coal merchant was well connected, known to councilmen, even friendly with local police. Who would take the word of a young clerk over his? Mounting pressure. Meanwhile, customers grew angrier. By winter's end, several factories filed formal complaints demanding an inquiry. Pritchard laughed them off, but his booming confidence seemed thinner. His jovial greetings grew curt, his temper flared at small mistakes. And Harold, watching from the office window, felt the weight of the secret ledger pressing on his conscience. The question. By spring, tension filled the yard. Rumors buzzed louder. Inspectors whispered of surprise audits. Customers threatened to take their business elsewhere. And Harold knew that the ledger in Ernest's desk drawer could expose everything. But could he bring it to light? And if he did, what would happen to him? By the summer of 1960, Harold Evans could no longer keep silent. Each day he copied invoices that he knew were lies. Each night he remembered the notebook locked in Ernest Pritchard's desk, filled with crooked numbers. Finally, Harold went to the local council office. Nervous, hands sweating, he asked to see the weights and measures inspector. There, in a cramped office smelling of ink and pipe smoke, he told the story. 2 ledgers, doctored weights, customers shorted again and again. The inspector, Mr. Thomas Bligg, listened gravely. He had heard the whispers, the complaints from factories and housewives. Now, at last, he had something more tangible than rumor. "Can you prove it?" Bligg asked. Harold hesitated. "If I can get hold of that ledger, yes." The audit. Bligg arranged for a surprise audit. Early one morning, he arrived at Pritchard's yard with 2 assistants. Ernest greeted them with his usual booming voice, though his eyes narrowed slightly at the sight of the inspectors. They examined the weighbridge, tested sacks, checked scales. Everything appeared proper. Ernest produced his bound ledger, neat and orderly, showing every ton accounted for. Bligg frowned. Without the secret book Harold described, he had no proof. Ernest, smug, slapped the ledger shut. "As you see, gentlemen, we run a clean business here." The inspectors left unsatisfied, while Ernest lit a cigar in triumph. Pressure on Harold. That evening, Ernest summoned Harold into his office. "You've been nosy, lad," he said quietly, no trace of his usual cheer. "You've been talking." Harold stammered denials, but Ernest leaned close, smoke curling from his cigar. "These ledgers are my concern. You'll copy what I tell you and you'll keep your mouth shut. Otherwise, you'll find yourself out on the street. And worse." Harold left shaken. He realized Ernest suspected him but had no proof. Still, the warning chilled him. Customers fight back. Meanwhile, customers grew louder in their complaints. Mr. Grant, the textile mill owner, filed a formal grievance with the regional fuel board. Other businesses joined him, demanding Ernest's accounts be audited again. Housewives petitioned the council, signatures collected in the market square. The pressure mounted. Ernest laughed publicly, dismissing it all as jealous rivals, but privately he grew tense. The second ledger surfaces. The turning point came in September. Harold, emboldened by frustration, took a risk. One evening, after Ernest left the yard, Harold lingered, pretending to finish invoices. He opened the desk drawer with a key he had quietly copied weeks earlier. Inside lay the notebook, pages of figures, initials, and annotations. He slipped it into his satchel, heart pounding, and carried it straight to Inspector Bligg. The secret ledger told the truth plainly. For years, Ernest had shorted consignments by 5 to 10%, pocketing the difference. He had underfilled sacks, misreported weights, and falsified invoices. The sums were staggering, hundreds of pounds skimmed quietly over time. Bligg now had proof. The raid. In October, authorities descended on Pritchard's yard. Accompanied by constables, they seized records, inspected stock, and took statements from clerks and delivery men. Ernest raged, shouting that it was persecution, that jealous rivals had poisoned the council's ears. But the seizure of the notebook silenced many of his blusterings. Within days, charges were filed: fraud, false accounting, and violation of weights and measures laws. The town reacts. Harrowford buzzed with gossip. Some customers felt vindicated at last, their suspicions confirmed. Others were stunned. Ernest had been generous, even kind, allowing credit through hard winters. Could such a man truly be a cheat? At the local pub, arguments flared. "He robbed us blind," one man said bitterly. "No wonder his pockets were fat." Another countered. "He's done more for this town than the council ever did. You'll see it's a stitch-up." The town was divided, loyalty clashing with outrage. Ernest's defense. As the case moved toward trial, Ernest hired a solicitor and mounted his defense. He claimed the second ledger was not a record of fraud, but of reserves coal kept aside for emergencies, credit given off the books to poor families. "Yes, the numbers don't match," he admitted. "But that's generosity, not theft. That's me helping people when the ration board said no." It was a clever argument. one that played to his reputation as a generous man. But auditors pointed out the reserves always favored Ernest, never his customers. The cliffhanger. On the eve of the trial, a new twist emerged. Ernest's solicitor hinted that he would produce witnesses to testify that deliveries had indeed been lighter, but at their own request. Factories, he claimed, sometimes ordered less coal than invoiced, paying for more on paper to keep within ration quotas. The fraud, then, was not Ernest robbing his customers, but customers colluding with him to cheat the ration system. If true, it would mean Ernest was not alone, that respectable businesses of Harrowford were complicit. The courtroom was set to hear the truth, but which truth would it be? In November of 1960, the market town of Harrowford buzzed with anticipation. The trial of Ernest Pritchard, coal merchant, was the talk of the streets, the pubs, and the parish hall. Housewives who had carried sacks into sculleries, factory managers who stoked boilers, and clerks who paid invoices all felt they had a stake in the outcome. The courthouse was packed on the first day. Pritchard entered with his solicitor at his side, dressed in a dark suit, his broad shoulders filling the dock. He still carried the air of a man who owned half the town, but the booming confidence was muted, replaced by tight-lipped defiance. The prosecution's case. The prosecution laid out its evidence with precision. 2 sets of ledgers, the public one and the secret notebook. Testimony from Harold Evans, the young clerk, who explained how he discovered the discrepancies. Weighing experiments showing that deliveries consistently fell short of invoices. Dozens of complaints from customers, from mill owners to widows heating small cottages. The prosecutor pointed to systematic fraud. This was no accident of scales, no generosity hidden off the books. This was theft, plain and simple theft carried out not with force, but with figures. Ernest's defense. Ernest's solicitor countered forcefully. He argued that the second ledger was not fraudulent but a working book, used to track informal credit and off-the-record arrangements. Witnesses were called, including 2 factory owners who admitted they had occasionally colluded with Ernest to adjust figures. Under rationing laws, businesses were sometimes allotted less fuel than they required. To keep boilers running, they agreed with Ernest to shift numbers, recording higher deliveries than actually received. The courtroom buzzed with shock. Were respectable businessmen confessing to fraud themselves? The solicitor seized on this. If fraud exists, my client is not its architect but its facilitator. He bent rules to keep this town warm, to keep factories working, to keep children from shivering in winter. It was a shrewd argument, appealing to the jury's sympathy. Harold under fire. But the defense also turned its fire on Harold Evans. They painted him as an ambitious clerk eager to rise by betraying his employer. You held on to this so-called evidence for months, the solicitor pressed. Why? Because you enjoyed your wages until it suited you to play the whistleblower. Harold, pale under questioning, held firm. I kept the ledger because it was wrong. I went to the inspector because I could not stay silent. His calm honesty won respect from many in the room, though Ernest glared at him with barely concealed fury. The verdict. After a week of testimony, the jury retired. The town held its breath. When they returned, the verdict was clear: guilty of fraud and false accounting. The judge sentenced Ernest to 3 years imprisonment, citing the scale of the deception and the betrayal of public trust. The courtroom murmured. Some gasped in relief, others in dismay. Ernest, stone-faced, was led away in handcuffs. The town reacts. The verdict divided Harrowford. For some, it was long-awaited justice. The merchant who had lined his pockets while others scraped by had finally been unmasked. For others, it felt like betrayal by the law itself punishing a man who, for all his faults, had carried many families through lean winters. Letters flooded the local paper. One praised the courage of the young clerk who stood up for honesty. Another decried the the witch hunt against a man who kept Harrowford's fires burning. The debate lingered long after Ernest was gone. The aftermath. Pritchard and Sons collapsed within months. Without Ernest, creditors pulled out, customers fled, and the coal yard on Mill Lane grew silent. Weeds sprouted between the cobbles where lorries once rumbled. Harold Evans, though praised by some, found his life uneasy. He was marked as the man who had toppled the merchant. Some admired his integrity, but others muttered that he was disloyal, a traitor to his employer. He left Harrowford within a year, taking work as a bookkeeper in Leeds. As for Ernest, prison stripped him of much of his bluster. Reports from staff said he kept to himself, working in the laundry, rarely speaking of his business. Upon release, he did not return to Harrowford but moved to a cousin's farm in Wales, living quietly until his death. A legacy of coal dust. What lingers from the Pritchard case is less the man himself than the lesson it taught. It showed how ordinary commerce coal deliveries, ledgers, sacks on lorries could conceal fraud as significant as any burglary. It also revealed the fragility of trust in small communities. For years, customers suspected but said little, afraid of accusing a powerful merchant. Only when a clerk broke ranks did the truth emerge. Reflection. Fraud does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers in ledgers, hides in half-filled sacks, and cloaks itself in generosity. Ernest Pritchard's crime was not dramatic, but it touched every hearth in Harrowford. And in the end, it left the town with a question it could never quite settle. Had Ernest been a thief in coal dust, or a flawed benefactor brought low by pride? Story 6. The Missing Postman's Rounds. In the late 1940s, just after the war, Britain depended on its postmen more than ever. Telephones were scarce, telegrams expensive, but letters were constant. Every town and village waited daily for the red cart, the steady tread of the uniformed man with his satchel. In the Warwickshire town of Bramley, that man was Albert Moss, a wiry figure in his 50s with a weathered face and a cap pulled low. For 20 years he had walked the same rounds, from the terraced houses near the railway to the cottages on the green. He was a familiar presence, nodding to shopkeepers, slipping envelopes through letter slots, carrying parcels in canvas bags. The townsfolk trusted him implicitly. He was not just a deliverer of letters but a custodian of secrets, handling birthday cards, invoices, love letters, and war news with equal discretion. The first complaints. In the winter of 1949, complaints began to trickle into the Bramley post office. A bill had failed to arrive at a factory office. A pensioner missed his allowance note. A young woman swore her fiancé's letter from the army never reached her. At first, the postmaster dismissed these as mishaps. Mail was often delayed in the crowded post-war system. But as weeks passed, the trickle became a stream. Entire bundles of letters seemed to vanish between sorting office and doorstep. Always, the missing mail was from Albert's route. Albert under suspicion. The postmaster, Mr. Fairclough, began to watch Albert more closely. He noticed the postman often lingered behind schedule, his satchel heavy in the morning but oddly light when he returned to the office. When questioned, Albert claimed delays came from chatting with householders, from trudging long stretches in winter mud. He denied mishandling mail. But suspicion gnawed at Fairclough. The integrity of the Royal Mail was sacred. A dishonest postman was unthinkable, yet the pattern pointed squarely at Albert. The discovery in the head. The first hard evidence appeared one frosty morning in February. A group of schoolboys playing near the canal stumbled upon a pile of envelopes stuffed into a hedge. Some were damp, others torn open, their contents missing. When gathered and examined, the addresses matched those on Albert's route. The town buzzed with gossip. Had Albert been discarding letters rather than delivering them? Or was someone else intercepting the mail along his path? The constable's visit. Constable James Ridley paid Albert a visit at his small cottage on the edge of town. Albert greeted him stiffly, pipe in hand, his wife bustling in the kitchen. "Some letters have gone astray," Ridley said carefully. "All from your round." Albert's eyes narrowed. "Are you saying I've lost them on purpose?" "No," Ridley replied. "I'm saying folk are wondering." Albert bristled. "I've carried that bag 20 years without a blemish. If letters go missing, blame the system, not me." But Ridley left unconvinced. The parcels. The mystery deepened when parcels, too, began to vanish. A tin of sweets sent from a daughter in Birmingham never reached her parents. A package of woolens disappeared en route to a cottage on the green. When complaints were tallied, most of the missing parcels contained something of obvious value: food, clothing, or money orders. The pattern suggested not accident but theft. A watch is set. By March, the postal authorities decided to act. Inspectors from the General Post Office, GPO, arrived quietly in Bramley. They devised a sting operation. Test letters and parcels, seeded with marked coins and coded stamps, were placed into Albert's satchel at the sorting office. Albert, unaware, set off on his round as usual. Inspectors followed at a distance, nodding his stops. When he returned hours later, his satchel empty, they pounced. A search of his cottage revealed several hidden envelopes, some already opened. In a tin beneath his bed lay pound notes traced to missing postal orders. The arrest. Albert was arrested on the spot. Word spread through Bramley like wildfire. The townsfolk were stunned. Their trusted postman, the man who had carried love letters and pensions for decades, accused of theft. His wife wept openly, insisting he was innocent, that someone had planted the letters. Neighbors shook their heads in disbelief. Yet the evidence, the hidden envelopes, the marked notes seemed damning. The question, and yet doubts lingered. Why would a man with steady wages and a long reputation suddenly risk everything for petty theft? Some suggested desperation, debts from gambling, or medical bills hidden from his wife. Others whispered darker theories, that Albert had been shielding someone else, perhaps a relative, and taken the blame himself. As Albert sat in his cell awaiting formal charges, Bramley itself wrestled with the question. Had their postman truly betrayed them, or was there more to the missing rounds than met the eye? After Albert Moss's arrest, the General Post Office launched a full inquiry. Inspectors descended on Bramley, combing through months of complaints, reconstructing the flow of letters and parcels on Albert's route. The tally shocked even the officials: over 200 letters and 36 parcels unaccounted for in the past year. Most were ordinary bills, catalogs, postcards, but a significant fraction contained valuables: postal orders, ration coupons, cash notes slipped inside envelopes. Each disappearance now had a face: the pensioner waiting for his allowance, the widow who never received her son's photograph from overseas, the factory owner missing invoices. Each was summoned to testify, their losses becoming part of a growing case. Albert's defense. Albert denied theft flatly. "I've carried that bag 20 years, he told the inspectors. "If you found letters in my house, someone put them there. I never touched them." When asked about the money orders discovered in his tin box, his explanation wavered. At first, he claimed they were savings from his wages. When pressed, he admitted they might have come from postal orders he had found loose on the street. The contradictions hurt him. The inspectors concluded he had been systematically stealing. The trial opens. In June 1950, Albert was brought to trial at Warwick Assizes. The case attracted wide attention, not just in Bramley but across the county. A postman on trial for theft struck at something deeper than stolen goods. It was a breach of trust in one of Britain's most dependable institutions. The courtroom was crowded. Neighbors who once greeted Albert warmly now came to watch his fate decided. His wife sat rigid in the gallery, clutching a handkerchief. The prosecution. The Crown laid out its case with force. They presented the sting letters planted by inspectors, some of which were found opened in Albert's cottage. Testimony from townsfolk whose parcels never arrived. The marked pound notes recovered from under his bed. The prosecutor argued that Albert had grown greedy, exploiting the privacy of his position. He was trusted to carry the words and goods of this community, the lawyer thundered, and instead he carried them to his own pocket. The defense. Albert's solicitor countered that the evidence was circumstantial. Letters could have been misplaced, parcels lost in the chaotic post-war system. As for the sting operation, he suggested Albert had been entrapped, baited with temptation by officials who had already judged him guilty. The money, he claimed, was indeed Albert's wages, saved over time, and the hidden letters, planted perhaps by mischievous boys or a rival. It was not an impossible argument, but it strained against the weight of evidence. Testimonies of character. Neighbors testified in Albert's favor. A shopkeeper described him as the most reliable man in Bramley. A widow said he often helped carry coal into her scullery, unpaid. Even the postmaster, Mr. Fairclough, admitted Albert had been a loyal servant for 2 decades. The question hung in the air. Could such a man truly have turned thief in his later years? The cross-examination. But under cross-examination, Albert faltered. When asked directly why letters were found under his bed, he stammered, "I kept them safe, meaning to return them." The prosecutor seized on the slip. "Safe? Why safe, Mr. Moss, if not because you had stolen them? Why not deliver them as your duty required?" Albert had no answer. A whispered alternative. During the trial, a rumor swirled through Bramley that Albert was covering for someone else. Some pointed to his wife, suggesting she had taken letters while Albert slept. Others whispered about a nephew who occasionally lodged with them, a young man known for gambling debts. But no evidence linked anyone else, and Albert, when asked directly, refused to shift blame. "If mistakes were made, they were mine," he said quietly. The jury retires. After a week of testimony, the jury retired. The town held its breath. Hours later, they returned with their verdict, guilty of theft and destruction of mail. The judge, solemn, pronounced sentence, 2 years imprisonment with hard labor. Gasps filled the courtroom. Albert's wife wept openly. Albert himself stood rigid, lips pressed tight before being led away. The cliffhanger. Yet even as the verdict was read, doubts lingered. Some jurors later admitted they were uneasy. The evidence was strong but not absolute. The motives never fully clear. And when, weeks after Albert's imprisonment, more letters went missing from Bramley, this time on a route handled by another postman, a question spread like wildfire. Had Albert truly been the sole culprit? Or had the real thief, clever and quiet, escaped justice while the trusted postman bore the blame? When Albert Moss was led from the courtroom in 1950, the people of Bramley felt a mixture of relief and unease. The Royal Mail had acted, the courts had spoken, and order seemed restored. Yet in the pubs and parlors of the town, conversation rarely ended with the word guilty. Some swore the evidence was undeniable: the hidden letters, the marked money, the sting operation. Others insisted Albert had been framed, that a man who had trudged the same route for 2 decades would not suddenly turn thief for a few pounds and sweet tins. The split cut through friendships. Neighbors eyed one another with caution, wondering who had spoken against Albert and who still defended him. Life in prison. Albert served his sentence in a Midlands prison. Reports described him as a quiet inmate, polite, hardworking in the laundry, keeping mostly to himself. When interviewed by prison chaplains, he continued to deny theft. "I carried those letters as best I could," he told one visitor. "If things went missing, I never meant it." But he never gave an alternative explanation. nor pointed to another culprit. His silence left a vacuum filled with speculation. Letters still missing. Then came the twist that unsettled Bramley even more. A month after Albert's imprisonment, complaints resumed. Letters again failed to arrive on schedule. This time, the route in question belonged to another postman, a younger man named George Atkins. A package of cigarettes vanished, followed by a letter containing ration coupons. Soon, more complaints followed, not as numerous as during Albert's time, but enough to raise alarm. The postmaster, Mr. Fairclough, was aghast. Could it be that Albert had not been alone? Or worse, that Albert had been innocent all along and someone else was at work in Bramley? Renewed investigations. The GPO inspectors returned, conducting another round of checks. They tested Atkins's route, planted sting letters, and searched his lodgings. Nothing incriminating was found. Atkins denied everything. But the disappearances continued sporadically. Small sums, small parcels, never enough to justify another trial, but enough to erode confidence. In the eyes of many, this lent weight to the argument that Albert's conviction had been hasty. If the mail still goes missing, why is Moss rotting in prison? Muttered townsfolk. Albert's return. In 1952, Albert was released. He returned to Bramley a diminished man, shoulders hunched, hair grayer. His wife had aged too, worn by gossip and loneliness. Though free, Albert could not resume his postman's duties. Dismissed from the Royal Mail, he found work instead as a night watchman at a warehouse. In the streets, reactions to him varied. Some greeted him with sympathy, pressing coins into his hand in quiet solidarity. Others crossed the road to avoid him, muttering about the thief who robbed the town's trust. Albert rarely spoke of his case. "It's done," he told those who asked. "No use chewing old bread." Lingering mystery. But Bramley itself never settled. For years after, rumors swirled that the missing letters had been the work of a gang, using inside help. That another postman, never caught, had continued the thefts. That Albert had indeed stolen, but only some, and had been unlucky enough to be caught, while others slipped away. The truth remained obscured, the evidence too muddled to resolve. The community's wound. What the case left most of all was a wound in the town's sense of trust. The postman had once been a symbol of reliability, a man who carried not only letters but the invisible threads of community. After Albert's trial, every delay, every mislaid envelope, every parcel that failed to arrive sparked suspicion. Even decades later, older residents of Bramley would recall the scandal. "Do you remember the postman who went to prison?" they would ask, shaking their heads. Still never knew if he truly did it. Reflection. The case of Albert Moss is less about the theft of letters than about the theft of certainty. Whether guilty or wrongly accused, his fall showed how fragile trust can be when doubt enters the system. For Bramley, the missing rounds were never just about parcels or postal orders. They were about the unsettling realization that even the most ordinary, dependable figure, the man at the door each morning, might harbor secrets. Closing thought. Albert's story leaves us with a question. When trust is broken, even by rumor, can it ever be fully restored? Or does suspicion linger forever, like letters undelivered, haunting the corners of memory?